So our panel, Deconstructing Islamic Art today, we have three very accomplished scholars, researchers, curators with us today who I'll introduce. The overall topic of deconstructing Islamic art it was one actually that was suggested by our colleagues in the Cultural Studies Department of the Ministry. In addition to deconstructing, though, I'd actually like to take this opportunity to reimagine the category as well. A lot of ink has been spilled over the past 10 years or so, I would say, about deconstructing the category, right? About picking apart the colonial histories and collecting histories that have led to the creation of a particular Islamic art canon, as is enshrined in our museums and our universities. And I think it's been fairly thoroughly deconstructed. So we can talk a bit about that today, but if we can also use the opportunity to reimagine what it is to do Islamic art from this perspective here in Jeddah, in the kingdom, I think that will be a fabulous outcome. So let me quickly introduce our speakers so we can dive into the discussion. I'll start with Dr. Sarena Abdullah. She's an art historian and currently Dean at the School of Arts at the University Sans Malaysia. She has a PhD in art history and an MA in art history from Sydney University and SUNY Buffalo, respectively. She has received multiple awards, including the London Asia Research Award and the CAA Getty Travel Grant, and has authored several publications on Malaysian art. She's an expert on contemporary art in Malaysia and Southeast Asia, and we look forward to hearing her perspective. Omniya, I think, needs no introduction in this environment, but still, Dr. Omniya Abdulbar. How to introduce her? I've got a small précis here. She has a PhD on Islamic history, specialized on the Mamluk period. Her background is in architecture and architectural conservation. I believe her first love was Beit al-Razzaz, which she has conserved and continues to work on. She is the Barakat Trust Fellow at the Victoria and Albert Museum, leading a project to digitize the KAC Cresswell Photographic Archive. And most importantly, for our purposes here, she was one of the curators who worked on the Biennale. So, and many congratulations to her and to the whole team for this amazing accomplishment. Professor Wendy Shaw, who I'm a huge fan of your work, and it's a real pleasure to talk to you today, specializes in post-colonial and decolonial art history of the Islamic world and modern Middle East. She has taught in multiple countries, if I'm not mistaken, the US, Switzerland, Germany, Turkey. Have I got all of them? Yes, okay, amazing. And authored books, including Possessors and Possessed, Ottoman Painting, and most importantly, for our purposes today, what is Islamic art? So she will be our frame of reference, and hopefully my questions to you, the hope is that the discussion today in our panel will give us a framework for the next 2 days for our symposium. We'll raise some of the critical questions that we want to ask about Islamic art. So, shall we dive right in? I've got a question for each panelist, a general question, and then we can open it up to the wider discussion. So, Wendy, unsurprisingly, we're going to start with you, if you don't mind. So your book, your most recent book, What is Islamic Art, I thought was really brilliant, trying to bring the notion of Islam itself back into the kind of secular art historical space. And if you don't mind, I want to quote a bit from your the introduction to your book. So Wendy opens her book with a number of propositions. It's got like a real Tractatus feel, which I really liked about it. The first 4 propositions I thought were brilliant, and many of our crowd in the audience are Islamic art historians, trained very much in the materiality of objects and courtly production, grounded in particular geographies and time periods, very much the kind of Hegelian perspective and understanding on the reconstruction of history. So Wendy proposes something very different in her book, for those of you who may have read it. If not, I recommend it. She proposes 4, do you mind if I quote the first 4 propositions?
I'm curious what I said.
You're curious what you said? Maybe you won't recognize it. It was a while ago. So the first 4 propositions, Islamic art emerges not from production, but from reception. Yes? Does that ring a bell?
Now I know what you mean.
Okay. So first proposition. Second one, Islamic art abides not in the object, but in the subject. Sound familiar?
Yes,
Okay.
now I remember.
Amazing. All right. Third one. Okay. So while Islamic art abides not in the subject, not in the object, but in the subject, yet this is your third proposition. Yet the subject of Islam need not be Muslim. Yep. Which I think is a very interesting one, especially for our purposes here. Fourth proposition: the object can be material, or imaginary, visual, sonic, or verbal. Right. And I thought that this These first four propositions, I think, very concisely and elegantly deconstruct the entire premise of Islamic art history as it has been studied in these sort of prestigious institutions of the West. So my question to you is, what are the implications of this series of propositions for the field of Islamic art?
Okay, I'll finish my answer in about an hour. But no, to be a little bit short-winded, hopefully, what I've come to realize since I wrote that book is that art history as a discipline emerges in the 19th century in the wake of the Napoleonic conquests within Europe. And what happens is that there is a German response to this prevalence of Napoleonic conquests. Since the Napoleonic conquests were deeply secularizing and taking church art out of the churches, and then the art that was taken out of Catholic churches became reprocessed through a Hegelian paradigm into museums. And so there is a secularizing shift that, first of all, is built into the art historical practice that emerges in the 19th century. So this is something that becomes imposed on every practice of art history that emerges from that tradition. So one thing I think I didn't note carefully enough in this book is that this isn't about Islam and the West. It's about a practice of modernity which produces a kind of subjectivity that's demanded by the modern. And I say demanded because obviously not all subjects behave accordingly. And one of the things that I've found very interesting living in Germany is that people conceive of themselves easily as secular subjects. They're not troubled by it. And yet, we don't just have Easter off as a vacation. We have Ascension Day off as a vacation. We have Pentecost off as a vacation. I mean, these are holidays I've never thought of. So people are thinking of themselves as a-religious, and yet there's religion in school. And this tension is very interesting for me as somebody who grew up in the United States, which of course struggles with its idea of religion, and also I grew up in Turkey, which also struggles with its relationship with a mandatory secularism. And so for me, what I was trying to do with these propositions, coming back to that idea, is that I think we need to rethink what are the boundaries of religion. Is it in the moment that we are articulating a belief as individuals? I think not. I think it's not so much about an individual, but a discursive cloud that we exist in, which I think I talk about in the book as perceptual culture. So when I'm in Germany, when I'm in the German cloud of perception, people may not conceive of themselves as being Christian, but there's a church on every corner. And this is part of the cloud of living in Germany. Whether or not I'm Christian, I am part of that environment, same in the United States. And so I think it's important to recognize that people have different faith traditions, particularly in the regions of Islamic hegemony, where many faith traditions have very strong histories, but also to recognize that this multiplicity of faiths doesn't take people outside of a discursive environment in which they're responding to Islam as a hegemonic faith, just as I, as a non-Christian, respond to Christianity as a hegemonic faith, even when it's not practiced actively in Germany, right? So that's what I mean when you don't have to be Muslim as such to engage with the discursive practices of Islam. And if we want to engage with culture rather than produce a catalog of material objects that function on the market or that appeal to tourists, if we want to engage with the material world as part of a way of accessing a world perhaps that either through time or through geography isn't part of a contemporary understanding of the world, we need to think about what are the discursive factors that people are engaged with, which could mean, are people encountering poetry? How is poetry engaging with religion? How are people communicating those poetic experiences to each other, much as in the contemporary world people quote movies to each other or quote songs to each other. So I think rather than thinking some people are Muslim, some people are Jewish, some people are Christian, the question for me isn't really these kind of nationalized categories, but a question of how do people who are communicating undertake this communication through, I think what you were talking about, a shared imaginary, a shared world view or world discussion about how the world is, which isn't just about our materiality. It's also about dreams. It's the discourse of dreams. It can be about predicting the future. It can be about astrology. It can be about a multiplicity of things that I think the emphasis on the locative and the historical that dominates art history leaves out. So art history, for me, structures a particular epistemology of the world that it demands from both its practitioners and from the objects so that things fit categorically. And I think as somebody who doesn't fit categorically, I'm very aware of it's very possible to not fit categorically, you know? And so the issue is, how does one become when you don't fit categorically? And I'm sure this is shared not only by those of us who are cross-cultural, but when I say this to people who are, you know, very German, sometimes they are almost relieved because they get to stop being the model of being the perfect German. You know, it's not just about being cross-cultural, it's also that these categories become identifications, but they also become straitjackets. And I think so it's important to think about art history or a practice related to art history as a discursive space in which we engage with multiple meanings, in which we as scholars and non-scholars communicate with each other and have discussions, and in which our discussions are based on information, but also are open to interpretation, are all open to multiple relationships with discursive worlds, and so on. So we're not in a competition of who's right and who's wrong, so much as we're part of a cultural space that is conveyed by objects as well as other things.
Yeah, that was very brilliantly put. Thank you. Can I ask one follow-up question before we move on to you, Omniya, following up from this? So in your book, you talk a bit about the sequentializing of objects, right, as part of the museum space. And you have a couple of great quotes where you talk about art history as mapping a system of value over a system of time, which you did, yeah, you wrote that. It was very good. Very concise, I thought, very nice. And so my question is just leading on from what you've described here. You talk in your book about the idea of, you know, perceptual cultures as a kind of accretion, right? An accretion of culture and an accretion of as you just mentioned, of poetic quotes, of songs, of a kind of habitus, right? That you live in. So my question is, and you have another beautiful quote from Dost Muhammad, his calligraphy preface, right? Human creativity praises God through devotional emulation, right? Which kind of flies in the face of the kind of secular notions of Western art history. So my question is, what would a non-Hegelian Islamic art biennale look like? Easy question.
Yeah, it's very easy. Okay, I'll say two things. One of them is it was really interesting. I'm really fascinated by this biennial because it does de-emphasize the locative and the temporal, and it makes a certain selection of ideas that are properly Islamic as a framework through which to engage with objects. And I think that this selection of these terms that are Islamic are related to Quranic selections, and that one could have various exhibits which choose various concepts as being central. So I think that this exhibit chooses one of many paradigms, but one of the things that I became aware of is that, and I think it's mentioned by, I don't remember the name of the artist, but this resonates very much with the work of the artist producing space through threads, Muhammad Shono. That one of the concepts which became clear to me in engaging with geometries is that these multiplicities are constantly shifting. And I think that similarly, a non-Hegelian approach wouldn't demand that one has the same sections from every exhibit, but rather would look at the relationships between objects as those objects are producing culture in the present and past tense. That is, one thing I really liked about this exhibit is that the moving away from the locative and the historical enabled a focus on the works in the exhibit so that they were articulating things that were pre-categorized. I think one could also see how these objects, and in some cases they really worked very well together, such as that textile object and the textile that was a river. And I think seeing how these works move to each other, one could have different flows and ideas in which one has a geometry that moves from one to the other. And isn't consistent, in a sense, because I think the Hegelian categorizations demand a consistency that enables progress, and that this delocalization and detemporalization in a way produces a relationship with past and future which is much more fluid. The other thing I wanted to mention is that What is Islamic Art wasn't the initial title of this book. Of course, my publishers wanted a different title. And the initial title of the book was taken from Victoria Holbrook's translation of Jalaluddin Rumi's Mesnavi. And the name of the book originally was Fortress of Form, Robber of Consciousness. And the reason for that is that once we have a fixed form, our consciousness becomes limited by that form. And so the form itself is the necessary vehicle for comprehension, and it also limits our comprehension. And that is a model for the engagement with the divine. And so I think it's also the notion that any static categories become a crutch through which we limit the possibility of our awareness. And so the question for me would be, how do we produce exhibits at knowledge that instead of shutting down our curiosity and placing limits on the possible, instead open question, open discourses, enable more possibility?
Thank you for that. That's and I agree. I think a multiplicity of viewpoints and temporalities and localities is actually what gives a lot of strength to this current Biennale as a kind of, I would say, producer of Islamic culture, right? Like we were able to reimagine and create something new through these kinds of events. So we can segue very nicely to Omniya with that question. So when you were thinking through the themes and the objects and the space of the galleries and how to narrate the objects and themes, you and the curatorial team chose a number of themes revolving around the rituals of Islam. Which I think actually speaks very well to Wendy's points about how to explore questions of the habitus of Islam and the perception, the kind of material, perceptual, sensorial feeling of Islam. So can you talk a bit about some of the curatorial choices that were made in how to display and narrate the objects in the Biennale?
Where to start?
Where to start? Start with the pavilions. The Makkah and Medina pavilions are exquisite.
Easy and very complicated and difficult in the same time, because you start from what kind of objects can we secure for these spaces. But I think from the very beginning, because when we started working on the Biennale, it was in the middle of lockdown and with all the hardship that we were going through. One of the things that kept on coming to my mind is space, breathe, calmness, the mental more than the visual. I always looked at this, the experience of visiting the Biennale. I always wanted people to go through it and then take a breath and then feel that they can take a moment and rest. And it just came naturally when we started thinking, we thought about the adhan because it's the very first thing that comes to mind, and then one thing led to the other, and we felt that we can start from the darkness to the light to more, and that the light would come more and more as you progress. I think it was, the ideas were there, but shaping them was the fun part of it, because it was lots of time a jigsaw puzzle in which we put something, take it out, put it in another place, not working here, trying different layouts as well, and playing with the objects and seeing also how can we create connections between these objects, whether the historic ones and the contemporary ones, and are we creating harmony in the way we're displaying them? Are they becoming exciting and engaging? How can we also attract the visitor? How can these spaces and objects also invite them to go and discover the following steps. But this is a little bit what we were thinking while designing the Biennale. And I really have to say that we worked with amazing scenographers who really understood what was happening inside our head. And that helped us also visualize what we wanted. And the more we worked together, we were able to eliminate what we really didn't want and then emphasize on what was very important, this moment of discovery that we wanted the visitor to have through the visit.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think that definitely was achieved. I mean, as you walk through, like the spaces have a real kind of affective quality, right? They very much they really move you, I think, as you move you emotionally, right? As you move physically through the different spaces. So I have a question following up from that. In terms of working with the contemporary art commissions, and I know you had a hand in some of the contemporary art commissions. There's this interesting question which Wendy and Sarena I think is also very relevant to your work as well, of this quality of Islam and the Islamic, and can contemporary art be Islamic? And we'll get back to you on that one. I'm sure you have both of you have a lot to say on that. But in terms of the contemporary artists, how did you find them responding to these categories of Islam and Islamic art and kind of reinterpreting? How did it find a place in their work?
Okay, I'll explain how it is for me first, because then it helped me explain and develop it with the artist. Because I'm someone who practices. I'm a technician, okay? At the end, I had to go to the books to understand what I'm working on. And so this dimension of history is very important for us to be able to create the contemporary even of today. And in my own practice, I work with people who are designing things that we can use today in our own homes. And it shows that these things could be inspired from the past, but still very functional, very modern. And this is when you realize that, especially in Islamic architecture, I personally don't see it as an architecture of the past, because I see what makes it very alive and exciting is the proportions and the harmony that it creates. And immediately you feel that the spaces are inspired and are giving you this feeling, because I believe Muslim architects were very, very keen on producing the moment and the feeling. They put the way, not just the functionality or the beauty. I feel decoration is another layer that I really don't see much, but it's really the proportion and the spaces that creates them. And I think, because this is how I'm feeling, and this is how I'm approaching as well Islamic art and architecture. So with every artist I've worked with, we really try to bring something linked to the tradition of the past, but then presented in the modern and the moment that we live in. And what I really was excited to work on is to show the continuity of a tradition, of a maker, of something that we can make that has lasted for centuries, that we can actually use it, but use it differently. And that's the beauty of traditional knowledge. And showing that this is a knowledge that should not be stopped because we stopped using things, but this knowledge can be developed and adapted and be used in different format. And I think with the Biennale, this is what we've been trying to do.
Wonderful. And I think, that relates very nicely back to the kind of academic discipline of Islamic art as sort of, was considered to finish before the Qajar period, basically, right? Until very recently, kind of the 19th century was not even considered Islamic art,
even
right?
After the 12th century.
Right, after the 12th century, if we're being, I'm sure we have colleagues in the audience who would say exactly after the 12th century, it's not worth even, looking at. So
it's hybrid and corrupt.
Yeah, it's hybrid and corrupt, exactly, and you have European influence. So I think one of the interesting things about questions of craft, for instance, or questions of contemporary art is how it it kind of turns these temporal categories on their head. So for Sarena, with your specialism in contemporary art, from the perspective of Southeast Asia, I would love to hear how artists there respond, if they respond to these categories of Islamic sort of cultural and religious inheritance, and how they work with these categories in their artistic practice.
Okay, like coming from Malaysia or Southeast Asia in general, I personally think that, the fact that these sort of like religious categories were not as, you know, effective in terms of artistic practices. Because I think, like in the case of Malaysia, which is the majority is Muslim, and also in Indonesia as well. Of course, Brunei is also part of it, which is a majority Muslim country. Like the way that we live is that, you know, Islam is already part of us. Okay, so. If the artists are being reflective of what they produce or what they do, it is a part of their personal belief, or, you know, Islam, you know, through Islam and all that. Okay, so whether they're conscious or not to sort of like purposely take up, you know, Islam or religion as part to be the subject matter of artistic practice, is that I think it's mostly because it's their personal consciousness, okay, in terms of their belief. Of course, there are a lot of artists who doesn't dwell on that issue as well, because there are many other issues in which they would raise in their art making that are not necessarily reflective of, you know, what we sort of like understand as Islamic art, geometric, you know, calligraphy and all that. But they come in with certain ideas that, you know, maybe contemporary issues, right? Like, you know, in terms of power, the criticism of the misuse of power, for example. So there are also artists who does or produces that kind of work. They were very critical of the maybe like government or certain issues that, you know, that happen in the country and all that, but doesn't make their work or them as like, you know, sort of like non-Islamic, because you know, as a Muslim, they are also raising, you know, concerns on what is happening around them. So I think like demarcation, whether they're conscious or not of being a Muslim artist or producing Islamic art, are not a very central question to their practice. But it doesn't mean that they do not practice or do not raise, you know, this as part of their practice itself. Yeah.
And I think that actually loops very nicely back around to what we started off saying, right? Which is that about the question of artistic production in Muslim societies by Muslims, that even if it's not self-consciously, right, engaging with, you know, a particular religion, because that is those are the cultural accretions and the habitus around you, that whatever you produce is going to be somehow enmeshed in that structure. So this is a question for all of you, and then I have a couple of other general questions, but mainly for Wendy. This is intentionally provocative, of course. Can Islamic art be contemporary?
I mean, I can't see how it couldn't be contemporary.
Exactly, yeah.
There's something I find puzzling.
To generate a discussion.
I mean, there's something I find puzzling in the insistence that Islamic art is pre-modern because of the notion of religion itself. Yeah. And I think that what probably for me is more fruitful is to think about discursive traditions. There's a work by Malevich that I really love, in which there are a bunch of squares and lines and things on the painting, and the thing that's absent is the cross. So it's an abstraction in which the cross is present through its absence. And that, to me, is a great summary of Western art. That is, we think of it as Western, but it's kind of crypto-Christian. Yeah. And the Islamic, similarly, isn't only related to the duties of practicing religion. It's also a discursive framework which includes things that are not pious. It includes things that are sacrilegious, because to define the sacrilegious, you have to have the religious. And so I think that there are many ways to engage with the discursive space of the Islamic that aren't necessarily producing an effect of the Islamic, but are responding to that discursive space. So I think that one needs to think about the potential of that discursive space much more vastly, because it's a world. And it may not even be a world everybody approves of, because there are always things in a world some people do like, some people don't like, and so on. But it's a world, just like the West is a world. And yeah, I mean, I think that one other thing, which is as part of a engagement with a discursive space, I think there are different ways of engaging with the norms of visuality that have been established historically. So you mentioned calligraphy, you mentioned, which I tend to think of not as pretty writing, but as the trace of the person inhabiting that movement.
It was also a meditative
It's
practice,
a meditative
physical
practice, but
yeah,
khat is more of a trace than pretty writing, which is an 18th century concept. So even there, we're making a mistake in naming it. You also mentioned geometry, which has, especially in Turkey, has been used, I'm part Turkish, so that's part of my reference frame, has been used like as symbolic, like Islamic. But what I find really interesting, and this relates to what Omniya was saying, is that people are constantly talking about geometry as design or as pattern and so on, but then people are like, it strangely reminds me of music. And I'm like, yeah, it's strangely reminding all of you of music. And guess what? The Brethren of Purity wrote about it, and they were like, it takes one the beginnings of theology. And so even it has its own agency. And so it's really interesting because if it has its own agency, and of course that's a big if, it means that the verbal ideologies we put on it, including its designation as Islamic, is irrelevant in relation to that agency. It does its thing. And so one doesn't have to be believing, non-believing, it has its own agency. And that's a really fascinating concept because then we have what Omniya was discussing in terms of a practice that produces a sensory experience that's related to a discursive tradition engaged with Islam. But it's not about this thing called belief, which is so deeply individualized and seems so like you're making a decision about it. And or collectivized. But the thing is, it's collectivized as a demand, but I think that this relationship between the collective and the individual is a very complex one. And it's sort of, I find it interesting to think of geometry as having agency because it's as if it's going to convert you on its own terms, you know. And there's this latent fear from medieval Europe of exactly that happening.
Geometry.
No, of Islam,
of
like
Islam,
creeping
like sort
in,
of converting you, acting on you visually.
Like the very first translation of the
seeping in.
Quran. Yeah, the very first translation of the Quran was done in order to counteract, I think it's against the false smoke of Muhammad.
Yeah, is that the Venetian
like
Quran? That
I don't. No, I think it's. I don't remember. Robert of Ketton.
Okay.
It's that one. But you know, it's this. There's this latent sort of. It's going to creep in, and I find that interesting because there's a lot in Europe which is informed by the Islamic.
Absolutely.
That also is very uncomfortable, and maybe geometry is one of those.
Interesting. I do like the idea of geometry acting upon you, having its own agency to act upon you visually. And you know, what's also interesting about geometry, of course, and you know, you mentioned the Ikhwan al-Safa and how it draws on these like Neoplatonic principles of, you know, proportion and the relationship to music. Music was also considered, of course, to act upon you in particular ways, whether you wanted it to or not, right? So I feel like there's some interesting parallels there that go back to your idea of perceptual culture as well, right?
Well, also that we can not only function within the visual, we can also rethink what are our parameters of creativity?
Yeah, exactly.
And how do we validate certain things as being creative, as being art, as, you know, and this brings us to the whole issue of the figural. How do we distinguish between poetry and the visual, which we tend to do? Is that valid? Is it valid to distinguish between the visual arts and the architectural arts
or sensorial
and
arts, scent or sound
and
or
so on, or food, which brings us together as communities, and so on. I mean, it opens up all these other ways of engaging with culture.
Absolutely, and I think that's actually a good point. This wasn't my concluding question, but I think actually this takes us to an interesting question, which is having thought through some of these categories, right, of Islamic art, the visual, the perceptual, sound, geometry, the way that it acts upon you and has agency on you. What are the implications for the next iteration of the Islamic Arts Biennale, right? If you just let your imaginations run wild, how could we translate this into...
She just got done with this one.
And we can open this question up to the audience as well. How much time do we have? We have about, okay, this is about when I was told to, kind of open it up for general discussion. So if there are any questions from the audience or suggestions about also what you would like to see, having talked through many of the categories that we presume to be sacred, for lack of a better word, to Islamic art, and have kind of deconstructed and reconstructed and reimagined. What do we want to see next time? Please.
But just to, because I'm trying to think while listening to you both here and trying to think about the way I was introduced even to Islamic art, because it just happened, but not through the classical roots. Because even when I was studying architecture, I think this is where the disconnection happens, because the way we are teaching at least in my case in Egypt, we are totally dissociating our new generation from their heritage and tradition. I only took 3 months of Islamic architecture in a 5 years in Cairo, where we could just go and be in all these historic buildings very easily. And I was so disappointed, because I always loved it in a way. It was something that I wanted to know more. And so I felt that the formal education was not giving you the satisfaction. So I went to the books, and I was lucky to have an uncle who had a huge library. So I would just go and pick a book and start reading it. So I think this is it's also the way we're teaching. It could be the same thing as well with Islamic art. It's the way we're teaching the younger generation. And I graduated 23 years ago, so I'm assuming it hasn't changed as much. But we are totally dissociated, and it is part of our tradition and our heritage that we just discover. We just do things, and then, this could be interesting, but we don't have the solid knowledge of it, unfortunately, even in our, in applied art or in architecture or in history of art.
Yeah, there's not like a structured
in our formal education.
Yeah, there's not like a structured pedagogy that like inculcates students with these principles.
But I mean, I think also this is part of the ideology of modernity and its universalism and so on. That things from the past don't have a value that is in the past, and they don't have an informative value on the present. And one of the things I really liked in this exhibit was how time was confused in multiple ways. And you could also see that with the mihrab, with the door of the Kaaba, these are all objects that are part of time. But they're also modern objects. Yeah. And in Germany, these are objects that are not in the art museum, they're in the ethnography museum. Because they're repetitions, and that's not allowed by modernity. So I find it really interesting what you're saying, because it's part of it's a mode of thinking that's colonial, even if we're not within a physically colonial framework.
Maybe can I add to that? I was just thinking along the line, having the tour just now, is that where does culture sort of like fit in? Because in Southeast Asia, for example, the culture becomes actually the foregrounding of art practices. Okay, of course, not all. I mean, like from Malaysia and also Indonesia, the Malay archipelagos, traditions, for example, like songket, batik drawings, and metal work. So that becomes fundamental to what we understood as, culture and also art. Though we don't use the term art, we use the term seni, that kind of thing. And only like the fact that due to colonization that we were introduced to modern art. And of course there's this dissociation between arts and crafts when, as modern art is being introduced. So that's like two stream, if we're talking about education, like the arts and crafts are being taught at a different institution, and the teachers are taught us about modern art and contemporary practices. So there's already like two stream there, but there are a lot of moments in which artists were sort of like were inspired by their own culture, as in those, applied, so quote unquote applied art practices, like basket weaving and all that, and put that in terms of their modern art practices. And of course, this is also being tied with. For example, like, in terms of Malay architecture, then you have a lot of decorative, decorative images, which is very floral based. So why this floral based is due to Islam, because there's figurative and all that, and also there's a lot of like geometric idea comes in. So these are the ideas that is being applied into like modern and also contemporary art. So I know that my sense is that going through the Biennale just now is that the sense of culture seems to be somewhat absent a little bit. I don't know, maybe I'm not getting it because I'm not familiar with the culture here. But when you're talking about contemporary art, that seems to be sort of like dissociated. I mean, how contemporary art is like, you could be seeing work A, B, C, and D, but you don't have the feeling like work C is from which region, for example. There's always sort of like contemporary sense that you sort of like lose that kind of temporal or sense of locality into the artwork, that kind of thing. So I'm sort of like having that kind of like observation through the Biennale, yeah.
And I think you made a similar observation, Wendy, about the kind of temporal abstractness, right, of a lot of the way that the exhibits were laid out. And I mean, we can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or we want more cultural specificity or less, or more geographical specificity in future biennales. Yeah, please, I sense you have a lot to say about that.
I just wanted to say, I think for me, the issue isn't, is it good or bad? I think the issue is what happens when you take this tactic, how does that function? Because what we have is a fairly defined canonical system of categorization in which one has a particular history. And I was also thinking how lovely it is to have foundational frameworks for Islam that aren't the 5 pillars of Islam again, right? Which don't necessarily play out very well when you're engaging with the arts. And so, that's an experiment. And I think that we have a much more lively discursive framework if we can think of these as experiments, they're trials, they're ways of doing it. And absolutely every answer will have things that are deficient, just like the paradigm that we already have. So for me, what becomes more exciting is if we can think about this cloud as something not that's shrinking, but as multiple clouds interacting, overlapping, changing form, if we can be at ease with that flexibility, because I think that the Islamic world is so vast, both geographically and temporally, it would be a huge mistake to think that we can have categories that control it. So, I think it's not that this did it wrong, it's that each iteration will have absences that encourage us to have different experiments. And that's the discursive framework.
Yeah, beautifully said. I agree. Okay, do you want to say something too? Oh, should we take questions from the, are there hands? Who, should I moderate or, yeah, please, go ahead. Sorry, I can speak loud. Do you want to take that?
Thanks, thank you. First of all, it's magnificent to be part of this panel. Congratulations to all of you. It's so illuminating in so many ways. And I would like to say that it's having just discovered with my wife the Biennale, only partially. I haven't seen the room number 5 yet, but
neither have I.
Yes. So this is a perfect dialogue and to continue this incredible experience. 2 nights ago, we just flew from New York, and I was attending another panel with 2 great ladies who really could feature equally on the stage. Two directors of the 2 most seminal institutions in the West: the president of the Louvre, Laurence Descartes, and Katie Fleming, the president of the Getty Trust, together on one panel. And the person who was asking questions said to Katie Fleming, well, how does it feel to run an institution that has nothing to do with contemporary art? And that's echoing what Wendy was saying. The past, your history stops in the 19th century and then nothing. And Katie had this extraordinary answer. She said, the minute anyone steps into the Getty Villa, anything, a Roman mosaic becomes a contemporary work of art. It becomes a contemporary art because you are a 23rd, 23 individual that reactivates that particular object in today's terms with your own history, etc., etc. And I think that what you were saying about decolonizing Islamic art and bringing it to the present very much is part of this dialogue.
And I would also add to that, as somebody from Los Angeles, actually, with the Getty, that of course, if we think about how the Getty depends on the money that was earned from petrol, then it's very much part of the contemporary, because an art object isn't only its birthplace, it's also the path that it's taken, and why does one need a exhibit like that in Los Angeles, and what does it mean to rebuild a villa in Los Angeles with what funds, and so on and so on and so on. So I think that we're always experiencing the past in the present, and we're always experiencing the future in the present also. We're stuck to this moment, and everything else is sort of imaginings that we maybe share or don't share, or how we share.
Thank you very much. This was wonderful and stimulating. I want to start with praising you for what is an enormously successful experiment. And
Truly.
One thing that this biennial has done, this particular display has done, is to put to rest any particular discomfort, I think, we might have about whether contemporary can sit comfortably with the historical. I think you should just let it go and not worry anymore about this. This is not a question of debate. And this experiment shows it very well, that we can, wisely done, live between the past and the present and think about the future. I also enormously enjoyed, I actually lost myself in the exhibition. I was very late for the first lecture because I forgot that I'm supposed to be here, because I thought this path that is through the ritual is so powerfully gripping that I could, as an historian of whatever we call Islamic art, and that's where I'm going. Give me a moment, if you don't mind. That you can quite see the ways in which all of the worlds of Islam can converge. And it's really profoundly powerful way of seeing it that way. Now, the question is the future, and in fact, the question about Islamic and what is Islamic art in the singular, in fact. And I really am grateful for Dr. Abdullah for bringing up a perspective that is not necessarily always shared in terms of the ways of art history across other parts of the practices of Islamic art, and vice versa. And so it's really a question of other kinds of materials. What are you going to do when it comes to, say, figural textiles of courtly use and paintings that celebrate narratives that seemingly have absolutely nothing to do with practices of Islam, and so on and so forth. So it's a really profoundly challenge you have put for yourselves. And it would be very interesting to think collectively, as you have aimed to bring everyone together to think collectively, but also think about what are your thoughts on how are you going to do this next time without location, without history, without naming names and places and so forth. I greatly appreciated what has happened in this exhibition, but what's the next one? I mean, we can talk about it, but I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm saying, how is this notion of Islamic, deconstructed, reconstructed, whatever you want to do with it, it's problematic. and its singularity is problematic, and art is problematic, right? So we are an aberration as a field. And so how do we deal with this one?
Big question.
Just as an addition to that, and I think you said it so lovely, in such a lovely way, but I think it's really lovely how the exhibit begins with the azan, and then it moves through, and one comes to the sort of idea of Mecca. So one's called, and then there's a response, but it's not Mecca, it's still a mystery. It's the box unopened, it's the untasted glory, in a sense, with all that white. And it was very moving.
We got this idea, and then I remember his face. He realized how people will see it, and you know, you just enter the room, and it's just, it takes you by surprise.
Especially since the Kaaba is black, but
Yeah.
we're in a white room,
Yeah,
and that was just.
exactly.
I think Allah has a question. I don't know if you wanted to respond.
Hi.
No, no. Don't want to talk too much. I mean, you're very kind.
Thank you.
Oh, you want to respond to Susan? Okay, please. Of course. Yeah, please.
Do you want my mic?
Do you want a mic? Yeah, take a mic though. Yeah. So we can hear you. Yeah.
Thank you. I love everything you said, by the way. This is not at all a critique, but I just I've heard several people also voice your question, which is what's the next Biennale about? And I would like, just as a naive person and a non-Islamicist, which I'm sorry about that, but I just want to say that I've gone through room after room with these waves of emotions that you're describing, and this powerful surprise. And I would like to maybe claim the right to be surprised again. Continue to surprise us.
That's a tall order.
I think just in addition to that, one of the questions that always come from a successful enterprise, and the danger of a successful enterprise, is what comes next, because it's not a repetition, it's a new practice the next time. It's new, it's not a repetition. And so the question is, how does one engage the same amazement when there's been an event that precedes it? And that's the challenge, but it also is an indication of success.
Julian, I wonder if you want to say something.
Yeah, Julian, do you want to take
No? Not at all. No, I feel you have something to say. Take my mic.
We
Yeah.
have some questions too.
No, but I mean,
Of course.
He doesn't want to, for real.
You don't want to? Okay, well, Allah have the question, and then I will read the question here. So, Allah in the back there with the blue blazer. If you can.
Oh, yes. So Julian doesn't want to speak. So, well, I'm going to join the thanks. I thought it was a very stimulating and fascinating discussion, so thank you all. And I agree very much with what you said at the beginning about reception and reception history being really fundamental, and that this is something that we as historians are discovering more and more, you know, in different parts nowadays. And I've been thinking, like you have, about how to bring this into a display, to come to your next question. And I'm wondering if digital technologies aren't a tool that could be used for that. So based on historical research, to try to use these quite powerful tools to bring the public to be able to see what we as historians can see in our imagination after a lot of work with text, with objects, and so on. And you know, I think there are many possibilities in terms of projecting on walls, something that the French have been doing in Paris lately. And well, I won't go into the whole list, but maybe there is something quite interesting to explore here.
Yeah, I think my main response is agreed, as long as it's done with the same subtlety as the work, because sometimes the work is amazing and the programming is like doesn't function. And one needs to be very careful with those because they need to have the same sophistication and lightness as what one's trying to frame without overtaking them. And the other thing I think that one could also engage with much more in this kind of exhibition is there were written Qurans, but there wasn't recitation, which is an interesting choice to make. And of course, there's the issue of translation, non-translation. There were surahs of the Quran that were written, but if one's not an Arabic reader, those are not, they don't engage with a viewer, right? And so that's a very particular decision, interpretive decision that's being made there. And there's a question of how one might bridge that gap in order to indicate even what that is to somebody without that knowledge. And the final thing I'll say in relation to that is that it came up, particularly I believe in the work on textiles, but I think that the incorporation of maqams might be something interesting to consider as well, particularly since in early Islam there's a lot of discussion about the affectivity of music and the appropriateness of music. And so there's a relationship whether or not one considers it sanctioned in either sense of the word sanction. There's an engagement with music as something powerful and effective. And so, you know, there are directions one could go, I think, that aren't only the digital, but one can work a lot with the mediality. And you'd also mentioned scent. And I think one could work with mediality in a different way.
And actually, one of the artworks does work with maqams.
Yes, that's why I thought of it.
Yeah, it has the azan, maqam,
yeah, absolutely. But I mean, there's so much one could work with that. You know, also with medicine, also with, there's so much that can be done. There are different directions that one can move.
Follow up on what Alan said. I'm sorry, thank you. And has to do with the way it is derailing the conversation. It's not about, I mean, certainly in this country, there's enough money and enough know-how to think you can do exhibitions that shock us with all kinds of technologies. But it's not about technology. It's about the principle, the concepts. And I really would like to bring you back to thinking about the concepts and where are we going to go? I'm not asking you to solve our problem right now, but you know, we need to really think about what is it that we are doing under the rubric of Islamic art.
I mean, I also think, oh, sorry, do you mind if I just
Not at all, of course.
Because I agree, oh, that was loud. I agree with you completely that we need to be thinking about everything we do, not just the Biennale, but also all of the museums, the collections, everything needs to be founded on a profound philosophy and done with like great intentionality, right? I mean, this kind of historic opportunity only comes once in a lifetime, right? To create something of this magnitude, to think about and reimagine what Islamic art is in the cradle of Islam. I mean, it's incredible, actually. It's an amazing opportunity, and I agree with you that every Biennale, every exhibition, every collection, every institution needs to be based on very profound thought, 100%, before we think about how to actually execute the digital. And I think that that's definitely the case with the Biennale, and one of the reasons why it was so successful. But yeah, I 100% am with you on that one. And I think, Wendy, this gentleman has been waiting for a very long time to ask his question. Please, you've been very patient, and please.
Sorry, I just have to echo everything that has been said about how breathtaking the exhibition is, and how inspiring. I'm sure the curation process must have been exciting. But thinking a little bit out of the box, thinking of the future and what next and how to go forward. Till when is this going to be labeled Islamic art? And when is this going to be the art expression of the people who produce it? Because that will create a new guideline for future exhibitions. Not necessarily built around the faith, but rather built around the art expression of the people of the area and what their or whoever is in that in this realm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all have lots to say to that. Yeah, I'll be quick and then I'll hand over to you. I think that's a very good point. Like, at what point is this just art, right? And actually, I want to bring it back to the opening of the panel, where we opened with your work. You have a brilliant quote in the introduction. Again, hopefully you'll recognize it, where you say that Islamic art as a discipline, and we're referring, of course, to the kind of academic 19th century construction of Islam. Islamic art as a discipline has outlived a number of its political functions, right? Which I think is very true, and I think might even apply in this circumstance as well, right? So I'll hand over, because I know everyone. This is a question, I think, that has sparked a lot of responses.
And this is why I think it's really important to think about Islamic art as something that can be contemporary as it engages with an Islamic discursive space. But somebody can both be engaging with an Islamic discursive space and a political discursive space and a familial discursive space and so on. So I think that it's a matter of how many discursive clouds overlap and what we're trying to say in an exhibition. So if the exhibition is engaging with the Islamic discursive space, then it's looking at those aspects of the work as they're in that conversation. But the very same works or the very same artists can also be in multiple conversations, just as we as individuals are in multiple discursive conversations. So for me, it's not so much about segregating the Islamic as a special preferred category, but also about recognizing the multiplicity of discursive spaces that we can be in particular in response to the ways in which art history and nationalism have constructed how we think about discursive spaces. That is, we're not in a vacuum where there are no categories. We're in a space where the categories are very stiff and overdetermined. And so the question is, how does one respond to those existing categories in ways that perhaps push against those boundaries, but then also perhaps construct new ones or enable a flexibility of boundaries, which would be my personal ideal.
I'll let you go first.
I have more to say.
Okay. I think the question of terminology, I think that's always the issue with the term Islamic art. We've been discussing this, this morning, for example, or should it be like Muslim art? Art from the Islamic region, for example. That's like another, way of like putting it out there. And of course, there are, pro and cons to this kind of like terminologies or definition that we are as art historians trying to sort of like straitjacket, and because it is more convenient that way for it to sort of like theorize and talk about it. But I think like as much as the work of as historians is trying to do, is that the fact that I think as practitioners, I think, or as artists, I think it is always the challenge of not putting themselves or the kind of work that they produce into a certain category. I think that is most important, because as an artist, you have the liberty of being creative and things like that, in which defies definition, categorization, and all that. And of course, like as an art historian, we will sort of like try and study the phenomenon, for example, and try to make sort of like grasp what's happening, the tendency, the trajectories that is that is happening at the moment within the construct of, I don't know, like Islamic art practices. Okay, there are so many terms that we can use, but I think like in terms of practices, as artists, one should not be defined by those categories. And of course, there are many ways in terms of tutorial in which you want to sort of like approach into a certain, certain themes or certain approach of, of this year's, Biennale, and maybe like another 2 years' time, what would be the expansion of it, for example. And that, allows a lot of, it couldn't or wouldn't be all inclusive, because it is, we have, I'm sure Omniya would have the, issues of limitations, budgets, or logistics, that kind of thing. But then for a premise of, for the sake of having a biennale, for example, what would be the most important things that what gets selected and what do not. So that would be the premise in which every year, or biennial approach of in terms of selections and curatorial decisions that is most important. Yeah.
I personally went through these questions in my own professional life of labeling Islamic when I'm not really feeling it. And that's why when we did our Mimbar project, we called it Mamluk, because we thought about, we wanted it to be specific, maybe to a certain period, a certain city. But I think when I think about Islamic for me is a set of skills and tools and vocabulary that I borrow to create something with, inspired, build upon. But it's a civilization at the end that is offered to you in a way that you can use to interact with and to test things and to try things, and I don't think one needs to be limited to specific boundaries. I think on the contrary, even what is presented in that form of art is very exciting and very unlimited as well, and extremely diverse, but yet you find not common practice, but what would I say? You find some sort of union or a link. You feel it. I don't know how to explain it, but it is just a treasure that you use in a way. It's something that you can.
And just, I think, do you want to jump in? Okay, just, I think we should probably draw to a close, but just to respond again to this question, and actually to make a bit of an argument for the category of Islamic art, right? And drawing on everything that's just been said here about, the capaciousness of the category, that it's a set of tools, it's a set of practices, it's cultural accretions, it's a sensorial experience, it's a habitus or a way of perceiving. I think that if what we're doing is constructing a series of biennales or experiences or exhibitions or collections here from this perspective, there's something very revolutionary about that. And I think there's also something very interesting and creative and fruitful in reimagining the concept of Islamic art from this perspective, from this geography, because you're also reimagining what it is to be Muslim globally, right? Because that's your audience, is the world who you're welcoming to the Biennale. So it puts you in a very special place, in a very special moment where you get to, through art and through visuality and through the sensorial, you actually get to create a more capacious category, I would say. Because as you've said, we can't escape categories. So how do we make them broader, more flexible, more capacious, more open?
Just a tiny addition to that, because I think that's a perfect comment. But also, when we're using the word Biennale, we're referring to originally the Venice Biennale, which also constructs art as a national practice. So it's a response to a particular history grounded in the 19th century, which produces what we conceive of as modern art as the representation of a nation. So here there's a counter discourse that's being produced. It's a commentary, it's not a vacuum, it's taking on a format and inverting it and replacing the national with this thing called the religious, and I'm putting that in quotes because religion is a whole other problematic category. But that's why I think it's important that it's being called a biennale, because it does have this iterative function. And just like the Venice Biennale has changed after its 100, I don't know how many years, this also has the potential to respond to how the idea of Islam is varying in relation to both practice and concept, which aren't necessarily the same thing.
I think we had, you said, Farida, we have one more question. Yeah, please. Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, first off, thank you.
Are we good?
Is this better? Yeah, okay. Thank you for a thought-provoking discussion. Second, I'd like to ask a question, just because the issue of category isn't complex enough, I'd like to add another layer to it. So you've touched about this briefly in your conversation, but the issue of identity and the challenges it poses both from an art historian perspective, but also from a curatorial perspective. And can you talk more about the interplay of identities that we see in these artworks, where you have a religious identity, an ethnic one, a national one, and sometimes these identities are not just overlapping, but they can kind of be contradicting, and there might be a contention between them. So how do you guys address this? Both, how do you present it in its complexity under one theme, without erasing all these layers and kind of, I mean, there's so much to ask about that, so whatever your thoughts on, I appreciate it.
I would argue against that, because the second we think of an identity as being pure, we already have an ideological construct. Yeah. And so that I think that for many of us, and this is a personal thing, the idea of me being an oxymoron is a construction of the ideologies that place what I am into conflict. Whereas I exist, I'm a being that exists, and the multiplicities that are within me or within any of us are only contradictions if we think of the other things as being true and pure. And so perhaps for me what is most important here, and I'll reference it in relation to this biennial, is that there are many people who are living in multiple cultures, who are living not contradictions. It's not like, my right hand is this and my left hand is that. It's that those are enriching our experiences and our capacities to communicate. And I think that, again, going back to the Mecca room, is that the concept of coming together in Mecca is to discover we've all been pointing in the same direction all along. And so there's an element in the way this exhibit is spatialized in which, multiplicity reveals itself in unity, right? And so the question is, for me, as we go about our real lives, what does it mean to produce our sense of home within our sense of exile? And of course I get that idea from Ibn Arabi's idea of ghurba, which is something I've been working on, thinking about. And I think that would be a very vivid way of thinking about future biennials as well, because we're invited to feel in conflict with our identities. But that invitation is also a legacy of colonialism.
Yeah, so we can turn it down.
Yeah, we can turn it down, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a lovely note to finish on. So thank you very much to our panelists for their wonderful discussions. Yeah. Thank you to our audience for your wonderful questions.